Welcome back to Kababayan Today. Dito po sa Amerika, meron tayong gera sa terorismo. Sa Pilipinas naman, dahil nandyan na si Duterte bilang presidente, meron ng gera sa droga. Panoorin natin si Professor Brandon Reilly for No History, No Self and what he can say about it.
Last time on No History, No Self, for the occasion of Duterte's inauguration as President of the Philippines, we explored the distressing history of political violence in recent Asian history. Today, we will examine the recent history of political violence in the Philippines specifically. Long before presidential candidate Duterte boasted about the violence he himself unleashed onto Davao, where he served in various elected offices, the Philippines was already a very violent place, not just in Davao or in Mindanao, or even for people deemed to be criminals, despite that during Duterte's tenure, for instance, they were never tried as such. Filipino history demonstrates that if we set aside events of national violence, such as foreign or domestic wars, the Philippines has been the site historically of numerous and recurrent sorts of political violence. During election times, for instance, mobs are assembled to coerce voters to choose a particular candidate, or to just stay home and not vote at all. There is also more general political violence not related to elections, in which partisans of the government, the Communist Party of the Philippines, or other groups subject their opponents to beatings, rape, torture, or murder. There are clan-based or community-specific forms of violence, such as rido in Mindanao, in which families feud with one another, often to the point of murder, over the course of generations. Seemingly every week in the news, there are incidents of anti-labor violence leveled by the government, wealthy families, or particular businesses against farm workers and wage laborers. Particularly alarming, and related to the previous, has been the violence directed against journalists since the end of the Marcos regime in 1986. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, a human rights advocacy group, the Philippines ranks third on the list of deadliest countries for journalists, because 77 journalists have been killed from the period from 1992 to 2015. The only two countries ahead of the Philippines are Iraq and Syria, respectively, countries that have undergone brutal, continuing wars in the last decade. And let us be clear, these are journalists who are being murdered, people who devote their lives to seeking the truth, to shining a light on the abuses of power, people who often live away from their families, place themselves in dangerous situations, and are paid mere peanuts in return. This, in brief, is a portrait of the Philippines that President Duterte vows to make better by making more violent. About journalists specifically, he has stated that he has zero reservations of killing them if they are, quote, corrupt. What determines if they're corrupt? Given his distaste for the legal process, that will of course be up to the president to decide. Although the Philippine Constitution creates a judiciary that is separate and independent from the president and Congress, under a Duterte administration, if we are to take seriously the president's own statements, the executive will be its own judge, jury, and executioner. Who cares what the Constitution allows? In this matter, as in all others, history can offer us a guide, but it cannot predict what will happen next. Asia's history of political violence, and the history of political violence in the Philippines specifically, offer no guarantees that the perpetuation of extra-legal violence will be a fact of our collective future. Indeed, given this history, we as global Kababayans must work hard to prevent such from taking place, namely by publicizing these abuses through human rights organizations in the Philippines and globally, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others. But when we do so, we will have to confront a Duterte presidency to protect human dignity. And that, in the very least, is a challenging, at the very most, a frightening prospect.
Magbabalik kami dito sa Kababayan Today. Stay around.